In the comfortable world of Disney adaptations and sanitized children's books, fairy tales feel like harmless bedtime stories filled with talking animals and happy endings. We imagine quaint villages where the worst thing that might happen is a missed dance or a broken slipper. But beneath the sugar-coated surface of these beloved tales lies something far more sinister, something that would make even the most hardened horror writer pause in recognition. The story we think we know is simple enough. Two children, lost in the woods, stumble upon a house made of candy and cake. A wicked witch tries to fatten them up for dinner, but clever Gretel saves the day by pushing the old woman into her own oven. They escape with pockets full of treasure and live happily ever after. It sounds like pure fantasy, the kind of impossible adventure that could only exist in the realm of imagination. But what if I told you that this tale, one of the most famous stories ever collected by the Brothers Grimm, was not born from imagination at all? What if its true origins lay not in the world of make-believe, but in one of the most horrifying periods of human history? A time so desperate, so utterly devoid of hope, that parents were driven to unthinkable acts of survival? The real story of Hansel and Gretel does not begin in a fairy tale cottage or a magical forest. It begins in the year 1315, in the muddy fields and starving villages of medieval Europe, during what historians would later call the Great Famine. This was not just a bad harvest or a difficult winter. This was a catastrophic collapse of the entire food system that would last for 7 brutal years and claim the lives of millions. The crisis began with rain, not the gentle spring showers that farmers pray for, but a relentless, punishing deluge that began in the spring of 1315 and simply refused to stop. Week after month, the esque after week, monthlies remained dark and heavy. The rain fell with such intensity and persistence that the very foundations of medieval agriculture began to crumble. Across northern Europe, from the British Isles to the Germanic territories, from France to Poland, the same terrible story was unfolding. Fields that should have been golden with ripening grain instead lay waterlogged and rotting. The constant moisture made it impossible for wheat and barley to mature properly. What crops did manage to grow were weak, diseased, and produced yields that were cut by half or more. But the failing grain was only the beginning of the nightmare. The endless rain made it impossible to dry the hay and straw that livestock depended on for winter feed. Without proper fodder, cattle, sheep, and pigs began to weaken and die in massive numbers. In England, records from Ramsey Abbey tell a story of almost incomprehensible loss. In one manor, only 6 animals survived out of a herd of 48. In another, the number of cows plummeted from 45 to just 2. The medieval world was not prepared for such a catastrophe. There were no emergency food reserves, no complex trade networks to bring grain from distant lands, no government programs to distribute aid to the starving masses. Society was built on the assumption that the land would provide, that the rhythms of planting and harvest would continue as they had for generations. When that fundamental assumption proved false, the entire social order began to collapse. What followed was a descent into a darkness that modern minds can barely comprehend. As the stores of grain dwindled and the last of the livestock died, people began to eat things that no human should ever have to consume. They scraped bark from trees and ground it into a bitter flour. They gathered roots, grass, and any plant matter they could find, often poisoning themselves in their desperation. The chroniclers of the time, men of learning and faith who had dedicated their lives to recording the events of their era, found themselves documenting horrors that challenged their very understanding of human nature. They wrote of people digging up recently buried corpses to strip the flesh from the bones. They recorded accounts of mothers cooking and eating their own children, rather than watch them die slowly of starvation. In northern England, the situation became so desperate that people were reduced to consuming dogs, horses, and what the chroniclers delicately referred to as other unclean things. The boundary between civilization and savagery had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated entirely. Families that had lived as neighbors for generations turned on each other in their hunger. The elderly made the terrible choice to starve themselves to death so that the young might have a chance to survive. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this catastrophe was what it did to the most vulnerable members of society. Children, those who should have been protected and cherished, became expendable in the brutal calculus of survival. Parents faced with the impossible choice between watching their children die slowly of hunger and abandoning them to an uncertain fate in the wilderness chose the latter. The practice was so common that it became a recognized social phenomenon. Families would take their children deep into the forests that surrounded every medieval settlement and leave them there, hoping against hope that somehow the woods would provide what human society could not. Some parents told themselves that their children might be found by more fortunate families. Others simply could not bear to watch their little ones waste away in their arms. The forests of medieval Europe were vast, dark places that stretched for hundreds of miles without interruption. They were filled with wolves, bears, and other predators that would make quick work of abandoned children. But they also contained something else, something that would prove crucial to understanding the true origins of our fairy tale. They were home to people who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of normal human behavior by hunger and desperation. The transformation was not sudden. It began with the hoarding of food, the secretive consumption of hidden stores while others starved. It progressed to theft, to violence, to the kind of predatory behavior that emerges when the social contract breaks down completely. And in some cases, in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest where no authority could reach, it led to something far worse. There are accounts from this period of individuals and small groups who had retreated so far from civilization that they had become something else entirely. Driven mad by hunger and isolation, they preyed upon the very children who had been abandoned by their families. The chroniclers speak in hushed, horrified tones of cannibals who lured desperate travelers to their forest dwellings with promises of food and shelter, only to make them into the next meal. This was the world that gave birth to the story of Hansel and Gretel. Not a world of magic and wonder, but a world where parents abandoned their children to die, and where predators waited in the wilderness to consume the innocent. The house made of gingerbread and candy was not a flight of fancy, but a bitter metaphor for the false promises that led children to their doom. The witch, with her oven ready to cook human flesh, was not a creature of supernatural evil. She was a representation of what human beings could become when pushed beyond the breaking point of civilized behavior. She was the nightmare that haunted every parent who made the terrible choice to abandon their child. The fear that somewhere in the dark forest, their little one would encounter something far worse than starvation. As the great famine raged on, year after year, these stories began to spread. They were whispered around dying fires by families who had somehow managed to survive. They were carried from village to village by the few travelers brave enough to venture onto the dangerous roads. And slowly, over the course of generations, they began to change. The raw horror of the original accounts was gradually softened by the natural human tendency to transform trauma into narrative. The real cannibals became witches with magical powers. The abandoned children became clever heroes who could outwit their tormentors. The terrible reality of parents choosing between children became the more palatable fiction of a wicked stepmother forcing the decision upon a reluctant father. But the core of the story remained unchanged. It was still about children abandoned in a hostile wilderness. It was still about predators who sought to consume the innocent. And it was still about the fundamental breakdown of the social bonds that should protect the most vulnerable members of society. The Brothers Grimm, when they collected this tale in the early 19th century, were not simply gathering quaint folk stories for the entertainment of children. They were preserving the cultural memory of one of the most traumatic periods in European history. The story they heard from their sources, particularly from Dorchen Wilde, who would later become Wilhelm Grimm's wife, carried within it the genetic code of genuine historical horror. The evidence of this connection between fairy tale and historical tragedy becomes even more chilling when we examine the specific details that survived the transformation from memory to myth. Consider the breadcrumb trail that Hansel leaves to guide them home. In the sanitized version we know today, this seems like a clever bit of childhood ingenuity, but the historical record reveals a far more desperate reality. During the Great Famine, there are documented accounts of families who would lead their children deep into the forest, leaving deliberate trails of oats, grain, or whatever meager food they could spare. The parents would tell their children they were going to gather wood or forage for food, promising to return by following the same path. But these trails had a darker purpose. They were designed to give the children false hope, to make them believe they could find their way back to a home that no longer wanted them. The cruel twist, preserved in the fairy tale, was that these trails would disappear. Birds, desperate for any morsel of food, would devour the breadcrumbs or grain. Wild animals, equally starved, would consume any trace of the path home. The children would wake up alone in the wilderness, their lifeline erased, their parents long gone. The fairy tale transforms this betrayal into an accident, but the historical reality was often far more calculated. The witch's house of candy and gingerbread carries its own terrible symbolism rooted in the desperation of the famine years. During this period, when a single loaf of bread could cost more than a laborer's monthly wages, the fantasy of edible architecture represented the ultimate impossible dream. Children who had not seen sugar or honey in months would have found the concept of a house made entirely of sweets to be beyond imagination. But the house served another purpose in the original tellings. It was bait, a trap designed to lure the starving. Historical accounts from the period describe how desperate people would sometimes pose as benefactors, offering food and shelter to travelers and refugees, only to rob them of whatever possessions they still carried. In the most extreme cases, these false sanctuaries became something far more sinister. The transformation of human desperation into supernatural evil was not unique to this tale. Across medieval Europe, the folklore that emerged from the famine years was filled with creatures that fed on human flesh. These were not ancient myths or religious allegories. They were coded warnings about the very real dangers that lurked in a world where social order had completely collapsed. The process of oral transmission that carried these stories forward through the centuries acted like a kind of cultural filter. Each generation of storytellers would add their own embellishments while removing elements that were too disturbing or too specific to the historical moment. The witch gained magical powers because it was easier to accept supernatural evil than to confront the reality of human monstrosity. The children became more heroic and clever because people needed to believe that innocence could triumph over horror. Yet even as the story evolved, certain elements remained stubbornly intact, like genetic markers that betrayed the tale's true origins. The oven where the witch planned to cook Hansel was not a random detail chosen for dramatic effect. It reflected the very real methods that cannibals of the famine years would have used to prepare their victims. Medieval ovens were large, enclosed structures that could easily accommodate a human body, and the historical record contains accounts of such ovens being used for exactly this purpose. The emphasis on fattening Hansel before consumption also reflects a grim practical reality. During the famine, most people were severely malnourished, their bodies containing little meat worth consuming. A predator who hoped to survive on human flesh would indeed need to fatten their victims first, making them worth the effort and risk involved in such extreme cannibalism. The character of Gretel, the clever sister who ultimately saves the day, represents something equally significant in the cultural memory of the famine. Historical accounts from the period often note that children, particularly girls, sometimes showed remarkable resilience and resourcefulness in the face of abandonment. They would band together in small groups, learning to forage, steal, and survive in ways that adults, set in their ways and broken by despair, could not match. These feral children, as they came to be known, developed their own codes of survival. They learned to recognize the signs of danger, to identify adults who could not be trusted, and to exploit the chaos of the times to their advantage. Some became thieves and beggars. Others found ways to attach themselves to surviving communities. And some, according to the stories that filtered back to civilization, learned to fight back against those who would prey upon them. The detail of Gretel pushing the witch into the oven was not simply a narrative device to resolve the conflict. It reflected a very real phenomenon of the famine years, where desperate children sometimes turned violence against their tormentors. The historical record contains accounts of young people, driven to the edge of death by hunger and abuse, who fought back with whatever means they had available. The climate catastrophe that triggered the Great Famine was itself rooted in a phenomenon that would later be called the Little Ice Age. Volcanic eruptions in distant parts of the world had thrown massive amounts of ash and debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and fundamentally altering weather patterns across the globe. Europe found itself trapped in a cycle of cold, wet summers and brutal winters that would persist for centuries. This climatic shift created the perfect conditions for social breakdown on a massive scale. The medieval agricultural system, which had supported a growing population during the warmer centuries that preceded the famine, simply could not adapt quickly enough to the new reality. Crops that had thrived for generations suddenly failed year after year. Rivers and streams that had never frozen solid became impassable ice barriers. The very landscape seemed to turn hostile to human habitation. The psychological impact of this environmental betrayal cannot be overstated. Medieval people understood their relationship with the natural world in deeply spiritual terms. The land was not just a resource to be exploited, but a sacred trust that connected them to their ancestors and their God. When that trust was broken, when the earth itself seemed to reject their presence, it shattered something fundamental in their worldview. This spiritual crisis manifested in various ways throughout the famine years. Some communities turned to increasingly desperate religious practices, believing that their suffering was a punishment for collective sin. Others began to suspect that supernatural forces were actively working against them. The witch hunts that would later sweep across Europe had their roots in this period, when people began to blame their misfortunes on malevolent magic rather than natural causes. The connection between weather manipulation and witchcraft became particularly strong during these years. People observed that their traditional methods of predicting and preparing for seasonal changes were no longer reliable. Storms would appear without warning. Droughts would persist when rain should have come. The growing season would end abruptly with unexpected frosts. These phenomena, which we now understand as symptoms of climate change, seemed to medieval minds like evidence of supernatural interference. Women, particularly those who lived alone or on the margins of society, became natural targets for this suspicion. During the famine, widows and elderly women were often the first to be driven from their homes when communities could no longer support their most vulnerable members. These displaced women, forced to survive in the wilderness, would have developed knowledge of wild plants, herbs, and other forest resources that seemed almost magical to their former neighbors. When these women reappeared in settlements, offering strange remedies or claiming knowledge of hidden food sources, it was easy for desperate people to believe they had made pacts with dark forces. The witch of Hansel and Gretel, living alone in her forest house, using mysterious knowledge to create impossible abundance, fits perfectly into this pattern of suspicion and scapegoating. The story's emphasis on the witch's particular interest in consuming children also reflects the specific anxieties of the famine period. In a world where adults were abandoning their own offspring to die, the figure of a predator who specifically targeted the young represented the ultimate violation of natural order. It was bad enough that parents could no longer protect their children from starvation, but the idea that someone might actually profit from their suffering, might feast on their flesh while others starved, represented a level of evil that demanded supernatural explanation. The transformation of this historical trauma into fairy tale served multiple psychological functions for the survivors and their descendants. It allowed communities to process and discuss their collective trauma without having to confront the full horror of what they had experienced. It provided a narrative framework for understanding how ordinary people could become monsters and how innocence might still triumph over evil. And it preserved essential survival knowledge, teaching future generations to be wary of false promises and too good to be true offers of help. The psychological mechanisms that transformed raw historical trauma into enduring folklore reveal something profound about human nature and our relationship with memory. The Great Famine did not simply end in 1322, when the rains finally stopped and the harvest returned. Its effects rippled through generations, shaping not just the stories people told, but the very structure of European society. The children who survived abandonment in the forests during those terrible years carried more than just physical scars. They bore witness to the complete breakdown of the social bonds that should have protected them. Many never fully trusted adult authority again. They formed their own communities on the margins of civilization, developing survival skills and codes of behavior that seemed almost alien to settled society. These feral survivors became a distinct social class in the decades following the famine. They moved through the recovering communities like ghosts from another world, speaking in whispers about things that respectable people preferred to forget. They knew which plants could sustain life when grain failed. They understood the signs that marked a community on the verge of social collapse, and they carried stories that made comfortable listeners shift uncomfortably in their seats. The tales they told were not the sanitized versions we know today. They spoke of specific places where terrible things had happened, of particular individuals who had crossed lines that should never be crossed. They vivid detail the sounds described in That Hungry Children Make when they realize their parents are never coming back, and the way human flesh smells when it cooks over an open fire. These raw, unfiltered accounts gradually worked their way into the broader oral tradition of medieval Europe. But they could not survive in their original form. The human mind has powerful mechanisms for protecting itself from trauma, and entire communities developed collective strategies for processing memories that were too painful to confront directly. The transformation process was slow and organic. A storyteller might soften a particularly brutal detail to avoid traumatizing young listeners. Another might add supernatural elements to distance the horror from everyday reality. Over time, these small changes accumulated, creating stories that preserved the emotional truth of the original experiences while making them psychologically bearable. The Brothers Grimm, when they began collecting these tales in the early 19th century, were not simply gathering entertainment for children. They were part of a broader romantic movement that sought to preserve the authentic cultural heritage of the German people during a time of political upheaval and foreign occupation. They understood that folklore contained essential truths about the human experience, even when those truths were wrapped in layers of metaphor and fantasy. Wilhelm Grimm's relationship with Dorchen Wilde, who became his primary source for many tales and eventually his wife, represents a crucial link in this chain of cultural transmission. Wilde was not simply a casual storyteller sharing amusing anecdotes. She was the daughter of a pharmacist, an educated woman who understood the deeper meanings embedded in the stories she had inherited from previous generations. The tales that Wilde shared with the Grimm brothers carried within them the compressed wisdom of centuries of survival. They were instruction manuals disguised as entertainment, teaching essential lessons about recognizing danger, trusting instincts, and maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. The story of Hansel and Gretel was particularly rich in this coded knowledge. Consider how the tale teaches children to be suspicious of adults who offer impossible gifts. In a world where predators might use false promises to lure victims, this lesson could be literally life-saving. The emphasis on sibling cooperation and loyalty reinforced the importance of family bonds in times of crisis. The ultimate triumph of cleverness over brute force suggested that even the weakest members of society could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But the story also contained darker wisdom that spoke to adult concerns. The transformation of the mother into a stepmother in later versions reflected changing social anxieties about family structure and child welfare. The detailed description of the witch's methods served as a warning about the specific techniques that predators might use. Even the geographical details, the deep forest and the isolated house, provided practical information about the kinds of places where children might encounter danger. The climatic disaster that triggered the Great Famine was part of a larger pattern of environmental instability that would define European life for centuries. The Little Ice Age brought not just crop failures, but a fundamental shift in the relationship between human communities and the natural world. Rivers that had been reliable transportation routes became treacherous ice sheets. Mountain passes that had connected distant regions became impassable barriers. Coastlines changed as sea levels fluctuated and storms intensified. These environmental changes forced massive population movements that destabilized traditional social structures throughout Europe. Communities that had existed for centuries were suddenly forced to relocate or perish. Cultural groups that had maintained distinct identities found themselves scattered across vast distances. The mixing and displacement of populations created new opportunities for the exchange of stories and traditions. The witch figure that emerges from this period of upheaval represents more than just individual evil. She embodies the fears and anxieties of entire communities struggling to maintain their identity in the face of overwhelming change. Her knowledge of herbs and potions reflects the practical skills that marginalized individuals needed to survive outside conventional society. Her cannibalistic appetite represents the ultimate violation of social norms, the point beyond which civilization itself breaks down. The evolution of the witch's character across different versions of the tale reveals changing cultural attitudes toward female power and independence. In the earliest versions, she is often portrayed as a more complex figure, possessing genuine magical abilities that could be either helpful or harmful, depending on how she is approached. Later versions increasingly emphasize her purely malevolent nature, reflecting growing suspicions about women who lived outside traditional social structures. The house, made of edible materials, serves multiple symbolic functions that extend far beyond simple wish fulfillment. In medieval European culture, the home represented security, stability, and belonging. A house that could be consumed represented the ultimate perversion of these values. It suggested a world where nothing could be trusted, where even the most basic symbols of safety and comfort might conceal deadly traps. The specific choice of sweets and baked goods for the house's construction also carries deeper meaning. Bread was the fundamental staff of life in medieval Europe, the basic foodstuff that separated civilization from wilderness. Sugar and honey were precious luxuries that most people encountered only on special occasions. A house made of these materials represented impossible abundance, the kind of wealth that could only exist in dreams or nightmares. The oven that ultimately destroys the witch is perhaps the most symbolically loaded element in the entire story. In medieval European culture, the communal oven was the heart of village life, the place where individual families brought their grain to be transformed into the bread that sustained the community. It represented cooperation, mutual dependence, and shared prosperity. The witch's oven perverts this symbol completely. Instead of creating food that nourishes the community, it is designed to transform community members themselves into food. Instead of bringing people together in mutual support, it represents the ultimate act of predatory isolation. The reversal that sees the witch consumed by her own instrument of destruction is not just poetic justice, but a symbolic restoration of proper social order. The character of Gretel, the clever sister who ultimately saves both herself and her brother, represents something particularly significant in the cultural memory of survival. Historical records from the famine period often note that girls and young women sometimes displayed remarkable adaptability and resourcefulness in extreme situations. They were more likely than their male counterparts to survive abandonment, more successful at finding alternative sources of food and shelter, and more capable of forming mutual support networks with other survivors. This pattern of female survival and resistance appears throughout the folklore that emerged from periods of social breakdown. The clever peasant girl who outwits the devil, the serving maid who exposes the corruption of her masters, the young woman who saves her community from supernatural threat, all reflect real social dynamics that survivors of trauma observed and remembered. The specific method that Gretel uses to defeat the witch, pushing her into the oven, represents more than just narrative convenience. It reflects a form of justice that was particularly satisfying to audiences who had lived through periods where normal legal and social institutions had failed to protect the innocent. The witch is destroyed by her own methods, consumed by her own appetite, trapped by her own tools of predation. This theme of predators ultimately destroying themselves appears throughout European folklore from this period, suggesting that it addressed a deep psychological need among survivors of social breakdown. When external authorities could not be relied upon to deliver justice, people found comfort in stories where evil ultimately contained the seeds of its own destruction. The forest setting that frames the entire narrative carries its own complex symbolic weight that extends far beyond simple geography. Medieval European forests were liminal spaces, existing at the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between the known and the unknown. They were places where normal social rules did not apply, where individuals might encounter aspects of themselves and their world that were hidden in more structured environments. For the survivors of the Great Famine, forests held particular significance as places of both refuge and terror. They offered shelter to those who had been driven from their homes, providing wild foods and raw materials for survival. But they also harbored dangers that went beyond natural predators. Desperate individuals and groups who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior often retreated to the deep woods, creating communities that operated by entirely different rules. The psychological impact of abandonment in such spaces cannot be overstated. Children who survived being left in medieval forests often emerged fundamentally changed by the experience. They had learned that the adults who should protect them could not be trusted, that survival often required adopting behaviors that would have been unthinkable in normal circumstances, and that the world contained forms of evil that respectable society preferred to ignore. These lessons, encoded in the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, served as a form of cultural insurance policy for future generations. They preserved essential survival knowledge while packaging it in a form that could be transmitted across centuries without losing its core meaning. The story taught children to be wary of false promises, to rely on their own cleverness and courage, and to understand that sometimes the only way to defeat evil is to turn its own methods against it. The enduring power of this tale lies not in its fantasy elements, but in its unflinching examination of what human beings are capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of civilization and the darkness that lurks within our own capacity for survival. Most disturbing of all, it reminds us that the line between victim and predator, between innocent and monster, is far thinner than we would like to believe. The transformation of Hansel and Gretel from historical nightmare into sanitized children's story represents one of the most dramatic examples of cultural memory suppression in European folklore. As the raw trauma of the Great Famine gradually faded from living memory, successive generations found ways to soften the harsh edges of the original tale, creating psychological distance from truths that had become too uncomfortable to bear. The brothers Grimm themselves participated in this process of sanitization, though perhaps not entirely by choice. When they first published their collection in 1812, their primary audience was not children, but fellow scholars and academics interested in preserving Germanic cultural heritage. The early editions contained detailed scholarly footnotes and lacked the illustrations that would later make the stories appealing to younger readers. But as their work gained popularity beyond academic circles, social pressure mounted to make the tales more suitable for family consumption. The idea that real parents might abandon their own children in the wilderness had become increasingly unacceptable to 19th century sensibilities. The transformation of Hansel and Gretel's biological mother into a stepmother in later editions reflects this growing discomfort with the story's original implications. This change was not merely cosmetic. It fundamentally altered the psychological impact of the tale by relocating the source of evil outside the natural family structure. A stepmother could be wicked without challenging the sacred bond between parent and child. The father's reluctance to abandon his children could be explained as weakness rather than calculated cruelty. The restoration of family harmony at the story's end became possible once the foreign element, the stepmother, was removed from the equation. Yet even this sanitized version could not completely erase the story's dark genetic code. Careful readers have long noted the curious detail that the stepmother dies at precisely the moment when the children kill the witch, suggesting that these two characters might represent different aspects of the same destructive force. Some scholars have interpreted this as evidence that the original tale understood the witch and the abandoning mother as manifestations of the same primal fear, the terror that those who should nurture might instead consume. The climatic forces that triggered the Great Famine were part of a broader pattern of environmental instability that would reshape European consciousness for centuries to come. The Little Ice Age brought more than just agricultural failure. It fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with the natural world, transforming what had been seen as a benevolent provider into an unpredictable and potentially hostile force. This shift in environmental consciousness found expression in the folklore that emerged from the famine period. Stories began to feature landscapes that actively opposed human survival, forests that seemed to move and change to confuse travelers, weather patterns that appeared to respond to malevolent intelligence. The witch's house in Hansel and Gretel, which seems to appear and disappear at will, reflects this new understanding of nature as an active adversary rather than a passive resource. The connection between environmental crisis and supernatural explanation became particularly pronounced during the witch hunt phenomenon that swept across Europe in the centuries following the famine. Communities struggling with inexplicable weather patterns, crop failures, and livestock diseases found it easier to blame individual scapegoats than to confront the possibility that the natural world itself had become unreliable. Women who possessed knowledge of herbs, weather patterns, or animal behavior became particular targets of suspicion. During the social breakdown of the famine years, such knowledge had often meant the difference between life and death for those forced to survive in the wilderness. But as normal social order was restored, these same skills began to seem threatening and unnatural to settled communities. The witch figure in European folklore thus represents not just individual malevolence, but a complex set of anxieties about female independence, environmental unpredictability, and social change. She embodies the fear that those who possess essential survival knowledge might use it for predatory rather than protective purposes. Her association with cannibalism reflects the ultimate violation of social bonds, the point at which mutual aid transforms into mutual predation. The specific methods attributed to fairy tale witches often reflect real survival techniques that desperate people might have employed during periods of social collapse. The ability to identify edible plants in the wilderness, to predict weather changes, to preserve meat without proper storage facilities, all would have seemed almost magical to people accustomed to more structured forms of food production and distribution. The witch's gingerbread house can be understood as a distorted memory of the kinds of temporary shelters that forest survivors might have constructed using whatever materials they could scavenge. During the famine years, people driven from their homes often built crude dwellings from bark, mud, and whatever organic matter they could gather. To hungry children, such shelters might indeed have seemed edible, especially if they were constructed by someone who had managed to preserve small amounts of precious sugar or honey. The emphasis on fattening victims before consumption reflects practical considerations that would have been well understood by anyone who had lived through periods of severe malnutrition. Starving people contain little usable meat, and their flesh would have been tough and unpalatable. A predator hoping to survive through cannibalism would indeed need to improve the condition of their victims before attempting to consume them. The psychological profile of the fairy tale witch corresponds closely to documented cases of individuals who turned to predatory behavior during periods of social breakdown. Isolation from normal community structures, combined with the extreme stress of survival, could produce forms of madness that manifested as complete disregard for social taboos. The witch's childlike pleasure in her house of sweets suggests a regression to infantile concerns with immediate gratification, while her methodical approach to victim selection reveals a calculating intelligence that makes her even more terrifying. The children's ultimate triumph over their tormentor reflects not just narrative wish fulfillment, but practical lessons that survivors of abandonment had learned through bitter experience. Gretel's ability to deceive the witch by pretending ignorance about the oven demonstrates the kind of cunning that desperate children might have needed to survive encounters with predatory adults. The next time you read Hansel and Gretel to a child, remember that you are not simply sharing a whimsical tale of gingerbread houses and magical forests. You are transmitting the compressed memory of one of humanity's darkest hours, a story born from the desperate hunger of the Great Famine, when parents abandoned their children to die and predators waited in the wilderness to consume the innocent. The true horror of this beloved fairy tale lies not in its supernatural elements, but in its unflinching documentation of what we are all capable of when civilization collapses and survival becomes the only law that matters.